trai mình có thể có một cái list khác đúng không ạ? Dạ em cảm ơn thầy.
Okay, so on to the last part of the day. Before we forget it, we wanted to return at some point to the scheduling of the online session next week to discuss the last problem set. Now, Kosaliasos tells me that he is going to teach you every day next week, for his words, from 10:30 to 16, but I presume he'll have a lunch break. But he says, I cannot come in between 10:30 and 16. So we'd have to go either before 10:30, but the issue for me is, if we did that, started at 8:30 or 8:45, or you have enough of a break before the others. Of course, that's 3:30, 3:45 in Germany. So I don't think I'm at my best at that time. So I'm afraid that's not really an option. But the option would be after 4 o'clock then only, I think. How is that for you? I would guess, but I'm asking you, that then you'd also first like to have a break, probably, right? Or you'd be happy to continue at 4 o'clock or 4:05 if you had 3 household finance classes before. Not such an obvious reaction as I anticipated, so that, from your perspective, options say that we would start at the 4:15, and we'll still have to discuss exactly which day next, whether it's Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday. Started at a 4:15 and go to a 5:45, or you say break, you move back home to the dormitory, wherever you are, and after some break, we'll later in the day have that session. That's the first thing I would need to know, and then we can talk about the day, because then also depends a bit on my calendar, and I couldn't do it every day in the same way. But I think what I should hear from you first is pretty much right after 4 o'clock or later in the evening.
Because I think we have at least one member need to take the bus back to Ho Chi Minh.
Sure.
Yeah, so I think she can only start earlier.
So would that mean realistically, for you to be back and have settled in and all that, 7 at the earliest or 8? 7:30, or maybe just 8 right away. Okay, so if you thought about that, a preference for 8 or even later in the evening, when do we have to end by local time here, that it's feasible for you?
For me,
anytime before midnight or before 10, or what's the cutoff time? If you have a strong preference, shout out, right? So that you make sure that your preference is heard.
So we only need one section, right?
One session, yeah. 1 90-minute session. Maybe a little bit extra, if you have lots of questions in the last session, and you want to be particularly well prepared and so on, but I would plan for 90 minutes. But if it goes 10 minutes longer, I think that could happen, not that I planned for it, but depending on what you guys are going to ask and all that, could be Yeah, I think the earliest we could start is 7:30.
Yeah. 7:30 to 9.
I understood better even 8.
Okay, that's fine.
Or 7:30 is very, very, very much on the safe side? It is, yeah. So then I hear basically, but I'm collecting still input, right? That it should be local time 7:30 to 9.
Yeah. Yes.
Anyone running into constraints within those hours? Anytime next week.
Book giờ trước đi phải book hay sao?
So I have to translate that back. Before I make any mistake, so that's between 2:30 and 4 my time. And I'm afraid Monday is out, Tuesday is out. Wednesday is out. Sorry, all these days I have meetings in that time slot. Thursday could be possible. But if you're already at Thursday, to put in another alternative, how about Saturday? Then I have a lot more flexibility.
Yeah, Saturday.
Because I'd say, if we don't do it Monday, it's not in the very short-term memory anyway. And the difference between Thursday and Saturday is 2 days, and maybe also you don't have a fourth class on any one day, right? How about Saturday?
Yeah, Saturday is fine.
Is okay?
Yeah.
And your preferred time on Saturday morning? Not early morning. I don't forget about morning. So we start at the earliest after lunch, right? And I can do it. What's the preferred time after lunch? So this from 1 o'clock forward to.
I think Saturday we also have class with Professor Haliasos.
I have to study with Professor Haliasos on Saturday as well until
Really?
4 p.m. Yes. Yeah, for
Street class on Saturday. I was always told I can't do class on Saturday. I'm not as powerful as him. So, okay, sorry about that. So we could do it Saturday in that slot.
Yes.
Unless you tell me under those circumstances Sunday.
No,
No.
I think Saturday.
Not Sunday. Okay. So Saturday. Let me double check my calendar once I'm back to the faculty apartments. I have my calendar there just to double check. But I think it's fine, and then I'll formalize it tomorrow morning. Then I'll have checked on it, but then I'll formalize it then. But I think this should be fine. Okay. All right. Have you got an email from Dr. Ha about dinner?
Yes, we received the
You got
information.
it. When is it? I don't know yet. Okay. But you can make it.
Yes.
You find arrangements to get there, and so on. I'm probably not the person who has a comparative advantage to arrange that, but you think you're fine. You don't need any further input from my side in the form that I checked back with Dr.
Có chạy
House.
gì 4:15,
Think you have
4:15
enough
mới ra
for
cổng
it.
luôn hay gì sớm chứ? Cho về nhà thay độ bộ đồ khác.
5 giờ mà.
Nhưng mà đây 4:15 gặp.
5 giờ là ở đây. Là ra đi luôn.
Is that the case? I don't see anyone wanting to ask about that. I checked back with him on something that you would like to be taken care of if possible to facilitate your attendance. Right? You seem to be hesitating whether you want to. No, you're fine with that. or totally not fine, and I can't do anything about it anyway. One of the two, okay. Then let's go back into real business like models, right? So I promised that I'd start off with giving you the chance to ask further questions about that before we go into new Keynes and DSGE models, and but the one new Keynes and DSGE model that we then also want to take to the data. But maybe just one more thing from my side then first, just talked about with you during the break. Maybe also one way to appreciate this whole thing better is to think about what was beyond this idea to say, we want to have structural models so that we can clearly identify policy changes, trace policy changes in a model where the shocks are labeled explicitly and depicted explicitly, say, as in this context, technology shocks. What was the idea of this whole movement? Was basically, if you go back to what Lucas, who was again the initiator of all of this, wrote down, he said, let's put the macroeconomy onto a computer. And then why is that perhaps something we need to do, at least often in economics? Because unlike in the sciences, engineering, we can't really do the construction of a lab, build an economy, and then within that lab economy, that's composed of real people, real households, real firms, carry out tests, right? I mean, the physicists, they can build machines and then measure the speed at which this or that particle does really operate and move, but we can't do that in economics, right? I mean, that's far too costly. So, let's declare some region a lab, and let's just try on them, which policies work and which not. We can't afford that, right? That's something that would go so long. So from that perspective, it's I think, pretty much without alternative in economics to say we need to construct labs within our models and then analyze those models with all the tools that we have from numerical analysis, from econometrics on the computer. Simulate these models on the computer, then analyze policy, use those models, of course, perhaps also for forecasting, and that way try to improve economic decision making. Now, this is not the only approach, right? Because some people would also say this may be a bit of a straitjacket, right? For example, this idea that everybody calculates expectations as a conditional expectations operator. Of course, there's lots of evidence that there may be boundedly rational decision making at place. In many situations, there's lots of evidence that behavior that we see, we learn about from the data may often be inconsistent with the kind of rational economic decision maker whom we depict within these models. So for sure, there's limitations, but I think at the end, if you look at research, because there's always going to be a place for these reduced form econometric models. I don't think it's ever going to be that everybody for every economic question that he or she faces will write down such an intertemporal optimization-based model. But what is also true is you see ever more of these fully specified intertemporal optimization-based stochastic models to explain a broad range of economic phenomena. Right? And so, for example, to give you just one context where you might think maybe this is not yet happening there, there's some really interesting work these days that, for example, looks at what are optimal decisions of parents to further their children's education, their children's eventually progressing in the workplace. And in the past, we probably have run some questions, on the children's welfare to some measure, again, whether it's education level or accomplishment or earnings of those children as a function, say, of, did they grow up in a single-parent household? Did they grow up in a household with at least 2 parents? Did they grow up perhaps, in a multi-generation household? You just run a regression on all these determinants. But nowadays, what you typically do is you write down structural models where you model, how those children are going to progress as they go through schooling, as they go through education, as they enter the workforce, and model that progressing as a function of different aspects of growth. Right? Again, for example, the choice of a parent, might they want to raise the child in a single-family household or a multiple-generation household, and so forth. And so, this is not just macroeconomics, this is very much nowadays also individual aspects of decision making at the microeconomic level, where you see this class of models becoming ever more used for credible and reputable. So with that said, any question about what a real business cycle model does do, what the propagation mechanism is in such a model, what the idea is qualitatively, how it can generate business cycles. Not right now, at least.
Not yet.
But from my side, one more time, right, at the risk of repetition, what this model does, it basically reduces business cycles to one type of shock. It says all business cycles are driven by technology shocks, and the core mechanism is when it's a more productive world, people will want to work more. They intertemporally substitute labor towards those time periods where it's earning higher rewards to work more. So you basically see labor hours going up as productivity improves. You see more capital being demanded. You see wages going up. You see the price of capital going up. And then as productivity comes back down to its steady state level, or potentially even below, then people substitute in the opposite direction, right? They substitute away from work, they substitute more leisure, there's going to be less capital being purchased, and so it's this phenomenon of intertemporal substitution in making optimal consumption savings plans, supply decisions, capital purchases decisions, right? Intertemporal substitution in that. When is it more valuable to produce? When is it more valuable to work? When is it less valuable to produce? When is it less valuable to work? That's the idea of a real business cycle model, and as we discussed before the break, that's a neat construct, I would think, because this is a matter of preference, right? What you call a neat construct and whatnot, so you can also disagree with that. But I find it a neat construct. But of course, it's far too little, right? To think that all business cycles are responses of the economy to changes in productivity. Is that, what happened around the global financial crisis? That this was a huge negative shock to productivity? I kind of doubt, right? I mean, this was a collapse of one major bank, Lehman Brothers. That didn't affect production technology in the manufacturing sector per se. Maybe, of course, in the finance sector, or if we think about production there, maybe that became more costly because borrowing of banks and other banks, securing liquidity would be more costly. That's just one limited portion of the economy, right? This is not affecting production technology at large. In manufacturing, in industry, in agricultural, in construction, in other service areas. Probably the right story there for sure has to be, if you think about the aftermath of the global financial crisis, that because borrowing was becoming more difficult, because it was becoming more costly, there was less possibility for households and firms to borrow, less possibility to fund consumption, less possibility to fund investment, and therefore consumption investment demand fell. And the story was probably much more of a demand-driven recession, not this kind of supply-driven recession. So I think it's really clear that this model could not explain all business cycles, but it's a neat starting point, I would say. But for sure, whether you call it neat or not, it's a framework that is fully consistent across all of the aspects of decision making. Right? You don't get some behavior of households from somewhere, some behavior of firms from some other, but you recognize the interactions. The households are the same who are working for the firms. There's the same who are, at least some of them, entrepreneurs who are running those firms. And that's the strength of this framework. It's fully consistent across all aspects of decision. Okay, and so in that spirit, let's now go to New Keynesian DSGE models, and in particular, one specific New Keynesian DSGE model that is going to be rich enough so that we could take it to data with some hope that that model might also yield some laws moving forward. Of course, right, the model that we have discussed so far, the real business cycle model, I cannot forecast the federal funds rate with it, because the federal funds rate is not even in there. Right? There's only households, firms. The only variables that we have are consumption, investment, output, wages, rental return on capital, labor hours, amount of fiscal capital use. But that's it. There is no monetary sector. There is no central bank market policy rate. So of course I could use the business cycle model to forecast the monetary policy. I need a model that has monetary policy in there. And so in that spirit, we now move to the New Keynesian DSGE model. The first slide is a little bit more about what I already talked about in the context of RPC models, about this research program, consistent decision making of households and firms. And what we're going to see is that relative to an ASAE model, as you may have studied it, say for example in the Blanchard textbook in the Advanced Fundamental Macro course, so relative to that, because it's also a fully stochastic model, we have the shocks well specified, the adjustment processes are coming from within the model. First, if you think back to an intermediate macro model, right, you have some adjustment or some variables, change of some variable, but the exact adjustment type has never been done by the model. The model just always pins down what is the new outcome. Right, if I, for example, start off from an ASAE outcome and then have a monetary policy shock, it will tell you what's the new outcome, but it will not tell you precisely how you get there from the old to the new outcome. You can tell some stories about it, but you don't have the exact time tag how you get there. That's of course going to be different, right? In the business cycle and now in the DSGE model, because everything is pinned down. All the dynamics of everything comes out of those decision-making problems that we specified, and nothing coming on from somewhere from the outside, except for those variables like the technology shock or so, right? That we see are exogenous, at least in terms of the shock to technology. That's truly exogenous, and so that's not coming from within the model. All right, so let's set up this model. Hopefully you now will recognize some aspects of this model from the real business cycle model, but for sure some are going to be new and different. And so we start again off with households. Households that are going to have very much as before the issue that they are wanting to maximize expected present discounted value of lifetime utility, right? Representative infinitely lived household. The household in each period values consumption, values leisure, but we don't bring in directly leisure, again we bring in labor hours, right? This utility of labor. And we have one new term in this utility function, that Z. That's going to be a preference shifter. Let me just move for a moment ahead to the next slide. The first order regressive process in the logarithm of Z. Small z is the log of capital Z, and the log of capital Z. Right? It's a first order regressive process with a persistence coefficient rho Z. And because I have several shocks in this model, now I need to put a superscript on the shock, capital superscript Z. Is the preference shock. So what this shock is going to do is it's going to create shocks to preferences. Right? That's the first type of demand shock. If, for example, I value in some period the utility that I derive from consumption leisure more than in another period, I want to have more consumption, more leisure in that period than in another. But the other way around, right? If that preference shock suggested in this period, I just don't feel like it. I don't want to consume, I don't enjoy my leisure time, how are you going to shift away consumption and leisure from that period, and you may end up working more in that period, right? So these are, in that sense, demand shocks, that they change your preferences and therefore change how much you want to consume goods and services, how much you want to consume leisure, and therefore also change how much you will grow. The first type of a demand shock. All right, beta is still our discount factor, budget constraint, a little bit different than before, because in this new Keynesian DSGE model, we will not per se have a physical capital stock. Production functions will only be a function of labor, and that's because of complexities. But with all the other features that we're going to add relative to the real business cycle model, it becomes a lot harder to keep track of capital stocks. And so we won't have them in this model. I suspect in the model that you studied with Aliasos, you also didn't have it there. It's quite a bit of additional complexity. Of course, there are such models with a capital stock, but maybe not the ideal thing. Here, we'll have another mechanism for people to save. Right? In the real business cycle model, how did people save? If they didn't consume, they purchased capital goods. Right? They had invested in physical capital. In this model, we'll have a bond. So they invest in a bond. That's the crucial thing, that we still have a mechanism that people can shift consumption across different periods to saving or dissaving. But this time, the this saving is not by purchasing physical capital or selling physical capital. This time, it's by means of a bond. BT plus 1 is the quantity of a one-period riskless bond, right? So, for example, if this in the end is going to be taken to the US data, this bond is probably a US Treasury bond. Nowadays, with Trump's big, beautiful bill, there's again some discussion whether that could not drive up the debt to GDP ratio in the US sizably, and whether financial markets therefore may not tag on a risk premium on these bonds, so that they cannot really be considered riskless anymore. But historically, if you ever do work in finance and look for a riskless asset, the typical thing that people use is the US government bond. Because nobody, I guess, believes that there's a possibility that this government in the end will default. And now maybe we can have a discussion with this big beautiful bill, whether the debt to GDP ratio goes up, and whether that may lead to the fact that the markets expect a higher rate of return or discount the price of these bonds if they want to purchase it. But in an abstracting modeling environment, it's probably still not such a bad choice to think of a bond that's issued by the US Treasury as a riskless asset. And that's what we're doing. Because that's going to simplify things. But if this was a risky asset, then we also have to think about how volatility in that asset is going to affect the decision making. And that we abstract from if we say this is a riskless bond. BT plus 1 is the quantity of that bond. It matures after one period. Again, that's just for simplicity. That in the budget constraint, right, you have the purchase of this bond in period T on the left-hand side with BT plus 1. Your other expenditure is nominal consumption expenditure. And PT is the price level, CT is the real amount of consumption, so PT, CT is your nominal consumption expenditure. And beyond spending on consumption, you can purchase bonds. If you purchase bonds, you save. In principle, you could also think of it that households could issue bonds. I just don't want to stress that so much because they just had said those bonds are treasury bonds, right? So to keep them riskless. But in principle, within the modeling framework, households could also issue bonds. And if they issue bonds, they are open, right? And so this way you can shift your consumption expenditure across through purchasing and potentially within the model logic at least issuing bonds. That's your expenditure. What do you have on the right-hand side? Your sources of funds. Let's start with the simple stuff, wages times labor hours. Right, is again the household's earnings, wages, salaries. DT is again a dividend. Households are the earnings of the firms. And you'll see in this model, there's going to be some set of firms that's going to operate under imperfect competition. So there will be dividends accrued. This time I definitely needed also in the end that these dividends can be non-zero because the firms, some of them will be imperfect competitive. We'll come back to that. And then finally, what are my sources of funds? The bonds that are purchased in T minus 1, right? With this notation here, that in T you purchase BT plus 1, means BT is the bond you purchased in T minus 1. And then that you accrue interest. And the interest that you accrue from T minus 1 to T is denoted capital R T minus 1. Right? So if you purchased an amount of bonds BT in T minus 1, you get back the principal, BT times 1, that's just the principal, but you also get back interest on those bonds that you purchased. And that means, of course, those savings of the past, if you purchase bonds, if your bond holdings are positive, they add to your sources of bonds. But if the other way around, you were an issuer of a bond, of course, they subtract from your dividends and labor income in terms of how much you can spend on consumption and bond purchases in T. So just a slightly different mechanism, right? How we introduce savings. This is more convenient here. In the real business cycle model, again, there were no financial markets, right? So you can't have bonds, and so there was a necessity that you would have a savings vehicle to purchasing fiscal year. But here we have, obviously, financial markets, simple structured financial markets, and that this is the only financial asset that people have, just as one pure riskless bond. But we do have a financial market, and so we don't need fiscal capital anymore as a mechanism to save up, to borrow, in order to have differences between account consumption and account. Functional form of the utility function, this is a little bit different than before. If you recall the real business cycle model, we had that constant relative risk aversion, right? Both on consumption and on labor hours. Utility functions, often people also use the local method specification. That's what we'll have in here. Of course, that means per se one parameter less, right? That's where it's going to help us a bit when we bring the model to the data. We don't have the coefficient of relative risk aversion in the consumption portion of the utility function because it's just a log utility, but for the disutility from labor, we have this, again, constant relative risk aversion specification into this version 5 that we also have with the business cycle model. Now, how does that preference shock enter? It multiplies your overall valuation within any given period of consumption and labor/leisure. Right, so it's again that you should think of this as saying, one period you say, wow, I feel good. If I have consumption today, I'm really going to enjoy it. If I have leisure today, I'm really going to enjoy it. And the other day, I don't know, you wake up in foul mood. And whatever you get, it's just not going to make you happy. Right? And so that's the kind of preference shift that we have. It's not shifting the relative utility that you get from consumption relative to leisure. Right? But it's rather an overall preference shift. Both are possibilities. Right? Maybe you have even both types of preference shocks, that they have one preference shock that, like in our setting, says in some period you feel better, you like everything better that you get, whether it's consumption or leisure. In other period you feel worse. And on top of it, right, you might say, I have also that in some periods I value leisure more, right? Maybe because the weather outside is nice, so in those periods I value leisure more, and therefore have a higher weight on leisure relative to consumption. That's not what we have in this model. The relative weight in consumption of leisure / this utility from labor is constant. Right? It's just the overall valuation that shifts. Yeah, think of it as a good move that. At least that's this preference. All right. Now, of course, we could set up again the Lagrangian, like we did for the real business cycle model, but we had already done that. So I'll not do that. I'll solve this household problem hopefully much more intuitive than the Lagrangian. But I need one formal constraint that we now need, right? Because for the capital stock, of course, you cannot hold negative quantities. In the real business cycle model, you have a positive fiscal cap or you have no cap. But you can never think about negative fiscal cap. But for bonds, it's different, right? As we said before, within the model mechanics, bonds can also be used to borrow because you issue bonds. So what is this constraint in 3 saying? The so-called no Ponzi type scheme. It says, in the last term, what is the real value of your bond holdings in period capital T, as capital T tends to infinity. Right? So we think about what is the value of my real bond holdings far ahead into the future, and maybe for intuition, think of this as my life comes to an end. Of course, literally we have infinitely long-lived lives, right? So your life never comes to an end, but in the limit, this way your life comes to an end. What this condition says is, when in the limit my life comes to an end, the expected present discounted value of my real bond holdings has to be non-negative. This is called stochastic discount factor. This is not crucial to the story, so let me not spend much time on it. It's basically our original discount factor, beta, which you may call a deterministic discount factor, multiplied by the ratio of marginal utilities from consumption in period capital T relative to the current. Right, so this is basically bringing in also a subjective reference term into that discounting beyond the deterministic beta, also stochastic component. Why stochastic? Because of course any endogenous variable, such as consumption in the market, is going to be stochastic. But it's a form of discounting. If you do asset pricing, maybe you saw it there. Yeah, we probably looked at stochastic discount factors in asset pricing bonds. There's used a lot, here it's not crucial, so let me not spend too much time on it. But what it does say is, in that limit, as your life comes to an end, the real value of your bond holdings has to be non-negative. That is, you cannot die in debt. There's a mechanism in place that somebody cannot accumulate that forever. Right? Because if you could accumulate that forever, what would be the solution of our optimization problem? Never go to work, always consume, and pass the debt to the next generation. Obvious solution, right? You don't need any intertemporal decision making as soon as you can have that. If the debt was never restricted, you just accumulate debt and enjoy consumption, leisure, stay away from work. Unless you work not like one of those individuals in this model, and you said, I have a positive utility for work, then it would be different. But in this model, you don't have a positive utility for work, but you only get a positive utility from leisure. So we must have such a constraint. This is a so-called no Ponzi type scheme. Did Michael Hariasos tell you about this, who Ponzi is? Can't recall. Ponzi was a swindler, a criminal who lived in the US in the early
Ponzi
20th
scheme.
century. He was, I think, from Boston originally, and basically he had a snowball system. He basically promised investors into his fund huge returns that he could never really earn, but basically he paid the initial investors those huge returns from the funds that were brought in by later investors. Right? So this is a so-called snowball system. It's of course not sustainable, and at some point it has to end. And for Ponzi, it ended somewhere in jail somewhere. So the later years of his life, I think, he spent in U.S. correctional facilities. If we had invented this model later, this probably would be called the no Madoff scheme. In that, of course, Ponzi wasn't the only guy who ever did this. Maybe you've heard about Bernie Madoff, also New York-based investor, whose scheme uncovered out the global financial crisis when lots of investors wanted to have their funds back, and he couldn't pay it back because they were consumed by him and his family, in essence. This is a really tragic story, right? Because in the end, don't recall all the details, but in the end, I think it was his children who turned him to the FBI. But anyway, same scheme, not sustainable at some point. It's not going to end well. All right, so that we rule out, and that means we get some sensible solutions, right? Where people will work, but they don't have unlimited consumption, but we get sensible solutions. Now, let's get those solutions without a light motion. Through no arbitrage arguments combined with budget constraints. So let's first think about our individuals deciding within each period on the consumption leisure allocation. Right? How much of their resources in essence to spend on consumption, how much on leisure. You spend resources on leisure because if you enjoy leisure, right, you don't work and you don't earn wages. Okay, so what does our budget constraint say about this issue? Of course, per se, the cost of consumption is PT times CT, and the wages that you earn is WT times NT. So now we think about, is there a possibility to improve upon an initial allocation on consumption and labor? Because in the background again, always for labor, think of leisure, initial allocation of consumption and leisure. Could we change it? And the change is denoted by DCT, DNT. Right? So we have initial budget constraint that you think, I might change from my initial allocation, whether it's an increase in consumption, that of course would have to be funded by an increase in labor hours, or decrease in consumption that you could that could let you cut your labor hours and increase the amount of leisure. That's just a budget. So what can you afford on the basis of the budget? Right? The change in your initial consumption / labor leisure bundle is described by the budget principle. Now coming your preferences. Right? What has to be true on the basis of preferences? If I have an initially optimal bundle C and N, what is the extra utility that you get from changing consumption and leisure/labor? Well, in 7 we have the marginal utility. Extra utility from consumption times the change in consumption plus extra utility from labor times the change in labor. At the optimum, if you initially were at the optimum, what is the extra utility that you can get? 0, right? Because you're already at the optimum. So we impose that we're initially at the optimum, and now ask from there what must be the optimality condition in N and C. By just rearranging 6 and 7, right? If we plug first in the marginal utility from consumption, the marginal disutility from labor, what does that have to be equal to? Well, according to 6 and 7, it has to be equal to the real wage, right? Because from 7, you can solve for dCt over dNt, plug that back into 6, and you get this ratio of marginal utilities as a function of the real wage. That's what we have in here. Now, what is that stuff? Marginal utility from consumption, right? We have log consumption, so that's 1 over Ct. Marginal disutility from labor is minus Nt to the power of 5. Right, so bring that in, and this gives us the optimality condition in 9. When interpreted, the notation is just below equation 9 on the right-hand side. Right, it shows you if I was to, after all, still want to work 1 hour longer, what is my benefit from that? The real wage that I'm earning in that 1 additional hour of work. And on the left-hand side, you have the cost of working expressed in consumption units. Right, so Nt to the power of 5 would express to you how much you decrease your utility in absolute terms if you were to work 1 hour more, have 1 hour of leisure less, and that is again weighted by, right, that large utility from consumption, which is 1 over Ct, so that comes back to the numerator. And we have the same optimality condition that we had earlier, except again the only change, right, is that now we have log utility in consumption. That's why we don't have this coefficient in the power of consumption anymore, but otherwise it's very much the same optimality condition, right, as we had before in the real business cycle model in equation 8. Same thing, right? On the right-hand side there too, we have the real wage. The only difference comes from the fact that now we have log utility in consumption, whereas before we had CRRA utility in consumption. Okay, that gives us the first part of our household decision making. What we had before that is going to pin down labor supply. Now we have the second optimality condition, right? Maybe we should go back one more time to the real business cycle model. We call the second optimality condition arose from, in that model, taking the path of Lagrangian with respect to the capital stock, then plugging back in the Lagrangian multiplier from the optimality conditions with respect to consumption and labor, and that gave us the so-called Euler equation in consumption. An intertemporal optimality condition for the household. So that's what we want to derive next in the setting of the new Keynesian DSGE model without such a Lagrangian, just with heuristic reasoning. So let's use the same heuristic reasoning as before. First of all, if I initially have an optimal pair in consumption in T and T plus 1, if I wanted to change it, so some change in consumption in T, some change in consumption in T plus 1, it has to be affordable. Right? It has to be affordable, and that's intact. If, for example, I said, right, I want to have some extra consumption in T plus 1. DC T plus 1 is positive. PT plus 1 times DC T plus 1 measures the extra expenditure that I undergo in period T plus 1 to have the extra amount of consumption DC T plus 1. I have to fund it. How can I fund it? By having less consumption in period T. For any unit less in consumption, kind of think as us giving back the consumption good that we don't want to consume anymore because it's feasible that we gave it back. We give it back at the price at which we purchased it. Right? And so that's my initial savings minus PT times DCT to less consumption in T. And what do these savings get multiplied by? By 1, the principal, plus R, the rate of return on the bond. Right? Because in this model I have a bond, so if I save in period T, consume less, I purchase the bond, and I earn interest rate RT on it from T. So I equate in 10 the proceeds that I get from consuming less in T that I will have available T plus 1 for extra consumption. Right? That means it's adhering to affordability, to the budget principle. Next, of course, we also need that if initially CT and CT plus 1 were optimal choices, what is the extra utility you could get from any change in consumption T relative to T plus 1? Well, if CT and CT plus 1 initially are optimal bundles, can you get extra utility from any reallocation? No, not by definition, because initially that's definition, right? And so this says the extra utility from that change in consumption in period T DCT and change in consumption T plus 1 DCT plus 1 is always 0 if I'm initially at the optimum. And that I can now use as the condition to solve for the optimum. Because if we again combine these two constraints, right, I know that I can solve from 10 for dCt divided by dCt plus 1. That is equal to pt plus 1 over minus pt divided by 1 plus r. Plug that back in, plug in that expression for the ratio dCt plus 1 into the expression that we have right here. Solve out in 11 for dCt over dCt plus 1, plug back in that expression that you got from 10, and this will have to give you 11. That we slightly rearrange. Recall the marginal utility from consumption because we have log utilities 1 over Ct. We have a 1 over Ct for that marginal utility and a 1 over Ct plus 1 for the marginal utility in T plus 1. That explains the 1 over Ct and the 1 over Ct plus 1. And then, of course, recall also that if we take that marginal utility across different periods, we have different preference shifters, right? In the period T, Zt, in period T plus 1, Zt plus 1. So that must also show up in the first order condition, and it does, right? That's this term here. And then finally, what do we have to have? Well, we have to have from 10 that 1 plus an unknown interest rate, pricing is in T, and T plus 1 have to enter as well. And the expression, the final expression is in 13. Interpretation, Euler equation as before. What do I have on the left-hand side? Marginal utility from more consumption in T. Suppose I was to consume infinitesimally or 1 unit more in period T, that gives me that extra utility 1 over Ct. And that must be equal to this utility from less consumption that I can now only afford in T+1 if I kept my latest supply fixed. And that's the right-hand side, right? This is the marginal utility, this utility in T+1. This is our preference shifter, right? That would say per se, marginal utility doesn't stay the same, but if I evaluate the marginal utility in T+1 relative to T, it has to bring in this ratio of the preference shift, that T+1 divided by ZT. And what is this last term? 1 plus the nominal interest rate over 1 plus the rate of inflation. That's 1 plus the real interest rate. Right? That's actually the definition of the real interest rate. Formally defined, the real interest rate is 1 plus the real interest rate is 1 plus the nominal interest rate divided by 1 plus the rate of inflation. And most of the time, we abbreviate that as saying the real interest rate is approximately equal to the nominal interest rate minus the rate of inflation. And that, of course, just follows as an approximation of that definition of the real interest rate. So this is, again, the Euler equation, right? It is indifference between current and future consumption in the sense that if your initial bundle is optimal, whether you consume more in T or whether you consume less in T, it's going to be set off 1-to-1 by the less consumption, more consumption that you can have in T+1, if discounted back correctly, if taking into account the preference shifters, and taking into account that if you want to consume more now, you have to borrow, then R is the cost of borrowing, and if you want to consume less now, then R is the rate at which you are rewarded on the savings. That's our Euler equation. I think we have to stop there, because the firm's discussion is a bit more than in the new business cycle model. It was a Koch-Douglas production function that we put into a static profit function and optimized the static profits. In this model, the firm. So for tomorrow morning, I'd like you to gain a little bit of practice in log linearization. You can log linearize all these nonlinear relationships in the RBC model, right? We have the answer in the linear file as to what the linearized conditions are. But the problem is that goes to the Newton's DSGE model that we just looked at. And then just leaves as a reminder, log linearization would mean that we take a first order Taylor series expansion. So if, say, we were to evaluate f of xt, we replace it by the first order Taylor series expansion around steady state. So XSS is the steady state. Right? So I approximate x at any point in time t by what is f at the steady state plus the first derivative of x times the difference between x and the steady state value. That's in the scalar setting. Of course, here we have multiple values, right? So these are not going to be first derivatives but partials with respect to whichever value we are working on. But what I'd like you to do, please, when you solve problem number 1, is work out such Taylor series expansions. Because I'm well aware of the fact that if you search the literature, and I don't know what Aliasos did, but irrespective of what he did, in the literature, you also find ways to log linearize with some tricks. And I don't want you to use tricks, I want you to use a Taylor series expansion, because the Taylor series expansion always works, and the tricks don't always work. So don't look for some tricks in the literature. In particular, there's some tricks that are compiled some time ago in work by Uhlich. Don't use those. Do a first order Taylor series expansion. And then I can assure you can always log linearize. initially it may seem a bit more costly than using tricks, may seem a bit more time demanding, but it always works. That's it. So please do that, but that's the only one question that you would please look at for more warnings. So I would expect that hopefully we'll not need the whole 90 minutes to linearize those two relationships, so that then we'll complete in the morning. That would be the plan, the discussion of the model, so that in the afternoon you can start to bring it to the data, not just start, but also keep bringing it to the data, with kind of estimation, forecasting, and looking at the DSGE model, so that we wrap up without too much rush and in time by the end of the See you tomorrow at 10. Oh, tonight, potentially. Tonight already, but just one problem, right? So you don't have to be afraid that I'll blame you tomorrow that you came to dinner. From the perspective of the problems, that I think you can still do it even if you came to dinner. So hopefully see you tonight, and otherwise tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock.